I want to thank you for joining us. My name is Craig Moss. I'm Chief Operating Officer at Create.org. My background is really in using management systems to try to improve compliance in a supply chain. So that's kind of the perspective I bring to this discussion. And joining me today is Leslie Benton, our Vice President. And Leslie, give a little background on yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Craig. For the first part of my career, I actually worked in private law firms representing companies caught in corruption investigations and prosecutions. From there, I went to Transparency International for about 2 years, where I worked again on corruption issues, both with the private sector and on the policy side. And for the last 3 years, I've been at Create as a vice president and the corruption subject matter expert.
So Create, just a little bit of background on us, and then we really want to focus this discussion on helping to share some thoughts with you on trends that we see around corruption, and then some ideas on solutions and ways that you can start to prevent corruption. Non-governmental organization. We developed our programs based on work that we had done with leading companies, think tanks, and universities around the world, including Stanford and MIT. And we've been active in a number of countries with our programs, including Brazil, China, Mexico. You can see the list there. And what it gives us is kind of a global perspective of how things are evolving related to corruption. And within that, though, it also gives us ideas of what companies are doing or need to be doing at the local level to be able to try to prevent it. So the agenda for this webinar is really to give you a little bit of a view of the global problem, an overview of some of the laws and the trends in the legal environment. We want to talk about the risks to an extent, and then really focus a bit on the steps that your company should be taking now. And this really is something that both we have to look at inside your company, but then also how your company is engaging with partners and subsidiaries and regional offices. And we'll tell you a couple stories about some of the challenges that come up with that. You may think that you have under control at headquarters, but when you really look even to your own subsidiaries or regional offices, you can see a huge drop-off in the level of involvement and the level of awareness of the anti-corruption program and how it's implemented there.
So we thought we'd start with just a little bit of context setting today. You can pick up any newspaper and you realize that for companies doing business really anywhere in the world today, corruption is a real and all too common problem. It's been estimated that corruption adds 10% to the cost of doing business and 25% to the cost of public procurement projects in emerging markets. There are lots of surveys that talk about how companies view corruption risk. One that I thought I'd mention, 61% of supply chain managers in a study that was recently conducted viewed corruption as the second most significant risk to their business, and that was a survey done by the UN Global Compact. So, we know that people are very aware of the problem, concerned about the problem. In the United States, enforcement of the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA, continues at a very aggressive pace. I was looking at some statistics just yesterday from 2014, and in 7 corporate enforcement actions, the Department of Justice collected $1.25 billion in criminal penalties. That's a tremendous number. It's something really, really big to think about. The U.S. isn't alone, though, really. According to the most recent TI report on enforcement by OECD countries, we know that Germany and Switzerland are actively enforcing their anti-bribery laws, and the UK is beginning to actively enforce as well. And in addition to that, the landscape in China and Brazil has improved dramatically over the last couple of years, with a new focus on enforcement in China, and of course a new very tough law in place in Brazil now that companies really need to be aware of. And we'll talk a little bit about the specifics in a minute. So that's the government side. But in addition to governments, the multilateral development banks are really stepping up their enforcement efforts as well. They now routinely conduct anti-corruption investigations of their own funded projects, and they have very far-reaching consequences for companies because the banks have debarment capability and they use it, and they'll often also refer cases to country enforcement authorities. So they will enact a penalty, but also work with the enforcement authorities and companies to go after criminal or civil prosecution as well. And so what's at stake? Again, millions in penalties, and we're not talking small millions, sometimes in the hundreds of millions. The Alston penalty that was imposed in the United States just at the end of 2014 was $772 million in criminal penalties. And of course, jail time for individuals. And in addition to that, sometimes even greater costs that the company will have to incur in investigations, hiring consultants to remediate, putting in place a new compliance program. We know that Walmart estimated that they have spent $449 million in 2 years on their anti-corruption investigation. And that was something that they said in early 2014. And at that time, they had estimated they were going to spend another $250 million in investigation in fiscal year 2015, and that wasn't the end of it. So, again, the costs are huge. External demand for compliance is coming from a lot of quarters as well. One in particular I wanted to underscore is investors. They're now demanding information about a company's commitment to corruption prevention before making investment decisions. And the European Union also has recently adopted a directive requiring companies to disclose non-financial information, and that includes information on their anti-corruption efforts. So, in this environment, it's essential for companies to ensure that they understand and can effectively address their corruption risk.
So if we look at the business impact, in addition to the legal impact, there's real operational risks that you're taking related to corruption. And the first, of course, is the disruption of business operations, not only from a focus standpoint and a resource standpoint, but literally the third parties involved, whether they be agents or distributors, can be prohibited from ongoing business. So there's a real business continuity risk that takes place. We recently wrote a white paper looking at how corruption fits into the overall enterprise risk management framework, and that's available on our website if any of you would like to download that. But increasingly, corruption is being viewed within the broader framework of looking at enterprise risk management. The other thing that we hear from companies is that once they have been paid a bribe or agreed to pay a bribe, that word gets around, and it really just opens them up to ongoing requests. So by preventing that in the beginning, putting forth a clear message that your company is not involved and does not tolerate that, it helps to prevent you from being under the gun all the time and having requests come in. As Leslie mentioned, you can be excluded from bidding on certain government or multilateral funded projects. The other thing is that there can be an increase in insurance premiums. Real bottom line impact there, because once that there's been a case brought against you, the insurance companies will start to increase the premiums charged for certain types of insurance. Of course, there's the financial damages and the loss, but then as Leslie mentioned before, the cost of the legal proceedings can be in the millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars between the investigations and the legal proceedings. And then finally, the reputational harm that takes place to a company. That's something that is really difficult to regain. And when a company has started to have one or more actions brought against them and starts to chip away at their reputation in the marketplace, particularly among other companies that they may be dealing with, among investment community, and other groups that would be important to your overall business operation?
And this is a heat map, actually, from the 2014 Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. And I think it's worth mentioning when we're thinking about this that corruption really can and does happen anywhere in the world, in both developed and developing countries. So there's really no country that's immune from the problem. In 2014, in this CPI, Transparency International measured the perceived levels of public sector corruption in 175 countries, and more than two-thirds scored below 50 on a scale from 0, which would be a country that's perceived to be highly corrupt, to 100, which is a country that's perceived to be very clean. That's not really encouraging news, more than two-thirds. So it's worth noting that corruption happens anywhere, so wherever you're working, again, in the world, you need to be aware of the risk. So that's the context. We thought we'd get now into just a few details about the legal framework. So, the bad news is that corruption happens everywhere. The good news is that governments have made a significant amount of progress, really, over the last 10, 15 years in adopting a legal architecture to address corruption. Almost every country has prohibited bribery and other forms of corruption in their domestic law now, many through adoption and implementation of international legal treaties like the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention or the UN Convention Against Corruption, which went into force in 2005 and to date has been ratified by more than 170 countries. So again, there's a full tapestry of anti-corruption laws existing globally now, and that's progress that has been made. The U.S. FCPA and the newish UK Bribery Act apply extraterritorially, that is outside their own home country, so they have very, very broad reach. U.S. authorities regularly apply the FCPA to both U.S. and foreign companies for paying bribes almost anywhere in the world, and the UK Bribery Act's corporate offense has elements that are arguably even broader. Again, Brazil has a new law that is also quite broad in its application. Unlike the FCPA, it applies to both corruption or bribery of domestic officials, bribery of foreign officials, and also commercial bribery or company-to-company bribery. So it's a very broad law. And because of the globalization of anti-corruption, companies with international operations are more likely than ever to face criminal and regulatory investigations on multiple fronts. And one of the things that we've seen because of this sort of increased focus on corruption is that prosecutors and regulators from different countries are increasingly working together. So we're seeing investigations start in one country and grow to multiple countries. We're seeing prosecutors working together, sharing evidence, developing cases. And the recent prosecution of Embed in Brazil is a very good example of that. That investigation started in the United States, with Embed being investigated by both the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice. And the U.S. worked very closely with the Brazilian authorities to develop that case, turn over evidence, and let the Brazilian authorities take over the prosecution. So that's a very good example of what's the new normal for companies now, and that is countries really working together to take these cases quite seriously. Some of the common features of the laws, I said earlier, many apply extraterritorially, that is outside the borders of the country that enacted them. Most include both criminal and civil offenses. All the major anti-bribery laws cover bribery of a foreign government official, but as I mentioned, the Brazil Clean Company Law and the UK Bribery Act, in fact, cover both domestic and company-to-company bribery as well, so they're quite broad. All of these laws prohibit a company paying bribes through its own employees, but also through third parties. And that's something we'll talk about in a minute, one of the key risks. You have to be very aware of what the third parties, your business partners, are doing on your behalf, because if they are bribing officials or doing anything that's questionable, that can come back to haunt you as a company as well. And they apply both to corporate and individual acts. And as I said earlier, individuals are facing significant jail time for violations of these laws. So those are some of the common features. Craig, do you want to take on the risk areas now? Well, I think Craig may have dropped off, but so I'll do this piece.
Oh, Leslie, sorry, I was on mute.
Okay.
Yeah, so if we start to take a look at the risks that companies face, let's take a look at it in a real practical way as to the types of situations and the types of third parties that companies typically deal with. And one of the things that we see is that historically the focus of corruption has been downstream toward the sales side. So people are usually thinking about sales agents or dealers. And that really is one of the key areas, and a lot of the focus of the FCPA and the other bribery laws are really focused on that downstream, the activities of the agents, of the dealers that may be trying to bid on a contract or win a government contract. But the other thing that we see is upstream corruption, and that can be related to supplier selection or other things in the nature there. And those also could be involving state-owned companies, for example. So there still can be a government involvement looking upstream. If we think about these different areas, you know, the scale of it varies quite a bit, but there are a lot of ways that the request for bribes can occur. So in some cases, if you look even under the category of gifts and entertainment expenses here, you know, it could be that direct gifts where you're asked to provide tickets to events or you're asked to provide excessive gifts, you know, $50,000 watches or things of that nature. But it also could be in the form of requests for making contributions, maybe contributions to a local organization that is controlled by an official. So there's a host of ways that can happen. And a lot of it really occurs in a way that can be difficult for some accounting systems to catch. So what we're looking at here is within the risk areas, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but what are some of the ways that you can build a program to try to capture and identify these red flags at an early stage? The other thing here is that you see often, of course, is government contracts. And in the case of government contracts, looking back now at the map that Leslie showed before, obviously the risk varies a bit from country to country. But by and large, in most of the countries of the world, there is some risk of corruption related to government contracts and government procurement. And so there are cases where, if you think about it from a risk assessment standpoint, you really want to be thinking ahead about where are higher risk areas. And in that paper that I mentioned to you before, one of the things that we really encourage you to do is to systematically think through where are the risks that we face, and then what would be the probability of something occurring related to that, and then what would the severity be? So if we think about the risks, we can't try to tackle everything at once, but we want to look at where we think the highest likelihood is going to happen, and then what would be the worst case related to it. So examples, I'll give you a couple quick stories, or a quick story related to that. We were working with one organization that, in their opinion, was at a relatively low risk. They were in an Asian country selling heavy equipment to a local government. Now, they considered it to be low risk because they hadn't really thought through the process. They didn't really understand that although there was a third party involved, that they still had liability for the third party action. They thought that there really was low risk to them because they were using a sales agent. So here's a case where they had not done their homework. They really didn't understand the real risks, and once their eyes were open to it, it was a whole new experience for them. They were really able to understand the risk that they were at just by having started to think through the process. And so in that paper that I mentioned, there's some really systematic things that companies can do to try to identify the risks, prioritize the risks, and then we'll talk about how you can start to manage against those risks to be able to help to prevent them or to mitigate the negative impact should something occur.
And that's absolutely right. One of the really threshold issues for any company thinking about developing a proper, effective anti-corruption program is to do that type of risk assessment. Another element that's equally important, and I know we're hitting highlights here, but I think it's important to underscore, is doing effective due diligence. Once you understand what your risks are and you've looked across your organization and you've developed a good list, then you can start thinking about going a little bit deeper, particularly in terms of the third parties that you work with or the transactions that you undertake. If you've risk ranked them, then you can start performing diligence, which is collecting information to understand a little bit more about those third parties or transactions. And again, it's impossible for a company to do the same level of due diligence on every third party or every transaction, but the information you've gleaned from your risk assessment will help you focus your efforts and use your compliance time and dollars effectively. And I like to use this case as an example of what happens if you don't do appropriate due diligence. It's a little bit old now, but it stands out as a stark reminder of just how important due diligence is. And very quickly, this is a case where the defendant was the co-founder of a luxury handbag line, Dunian Burke. He invested $8 million in the privatization of the Azerbaijani state-owned oil company. He was working through an agent that was hired specifically to help get this deal done, and part of the money that he invested actually went to pay bribes from the agent to some officials in Azerbaijan. Burke was charged with bribery, not because he was alleged to have any direct knowledge or to have bribed on his own, but because he didn't do due diligence, and the government alleged that had he done any due diligence whatsoever, he would have understood that his agent was engaged in a bribery scheme. And he was convicted. He was sentenced to a year and a day in jail and 3 years supervised release, and he paid $1 million in fines. Now, his lawyers had argued that he was simply guilty of being negligent, just not asking questions before making a foreign investment. And in fact, he actually lost the money in this investment. The oil company ultimately wasn't privatized. He lost his investment money. But the fact that he had not taken any effort to understand what was happening was enough to result in his conviction. So just, again, a very stark reminder of how important due diligence really can be. So we've covered some of this already, but just again to underscore, as I noted previously, the U.S. is vigorously enforcing the FCPA, and these are some notable examples. And you'll see here, too, that these are companies that are U.S.-based, but also foreign-based as well. And you can note the significant amount of the fine. And this is just another example of some of the foreign enforcement we have seen. Again, just to note that the U.S. is not the only country enforcing its laws. And again, noting the significant and substantial penalties that are attached to these cases. And I mentioned this a few minutes ago as an example of what's happening now with countries working together to investigate and prosecute bribery. These are just some of the facts about the Embraer case, which again started in the United States and has now ended in a Brazilian prosecution of the company.
So if we start to think about putting this back in perspective and in context for you as companies, what are some of the key takeaways from this, and what do we see as the kind of the global environment around this? Well, number one is continued aggressive enforcement. And we really want to underscore that. There will be an increase in enforcement and an increase in cooperation internationally among governments. So for companies operating in multiple countries, it really increases the importance of your ability to monitor third parties that you're dealing with across a wide range of countries, which is a challenge, and we're going to get into some of the solutions around that in a minute. I just read something recently that even in the United States that the FBI is adding additional agents specifically targeted toward corruption investigations. So we clearly see this as a trend toward more aggressive enforcement. Related to that, increased prosecution of individuals. And here's a situation where the individuals involved really have to be careful about their role, and they need to feel there has to be a level of protection that they can show that they have gone through a proper process to be able to be aware of what is happening. And it's that awareness that is critical. In the case that Leslie mentioned, the person was convicted really because of a lack of awareness. You cannot say that you're unaware. You can't use willful blindness as a defense against this. There is an expectation that individuals and corporations do have awareness and are doing the proper amount of due diligence and the proper amount of ongoing monitoring. I mentioned before about the international cooperation and the enforcement in multiple jurisdictions, as the Embraer case points out. And then the final piece here is increased scrutiny of compliance programs. How good is your program? What does it look like? Is it on paper only, or is it implemented? And that's what we're going to focus on next, is really starting to look at what does an effective compliance program look like. But as we start to think about this, it's really important to think beyond the piece of paper. We see a lot of companies hiding behind a policy statement. So they have a policy statement that says, we will not engage in corrupt activities. Boom, it goes up. Boom, it goes out on the website. Boom, it goes in the contracts that they sign. But we don't see any implementation. We don't see anything behind it. And increasingly, enforcement agencies will be looking at the level of implementation of your compliance program and how thorough that was.
So we're going to start now and talk a little bit about what effective compliance looks like. And before we get into some of the details, it's important to note that there are a lot of guidelines out there for companies. We mentioned earlier that the anti-corruption laws that are on the books today look very, very similar. They, in some details, they differ. Some are broader than others. But in large measure, they're very similar. They prohibit the same kinds of conduct. And as a result, the guidelines that have been developed over the last 10 or so years are also very similar in what they say to a company about a compliance program. What do you need in place to comply with these laws? So at this point in time, I think it's fair to say that there really is a global consensus about what good compliance looks like. And these are just some of the guidelines you can turn to if you want a picture of what that looks like. They come from authoritative sources, from government, including the U.S. government, the UK Ministry of Justice, international organizations like the OECD, the World Economic Forum, the United Nations Global Compact. Transparency International, again, has a model code for companies to follow, and they're all remarkably similar. Companies, as Craig said earlier, are expected now to adopt and maintain risk-based compliance programs, so getting back to the risk assessment that Craig spoke about earlier. And this is really key, again, just to ensure that your program actually addresses the real risks that you face. And that those programs apply to all parts of the organization. This is something that Craig mentioned earlier as well, including your subs or your foreign operations and your third parties. And we have seen that many times companies will have adopted very strong, effective, comprehensive programs in their headquarters, but implementation may be weak as you get farther away from the center, as you get to your subs, the regional offices. But that won't be an excuse. So risk-based programs that apply throughout the organization is really what the governments and enforcement authorities are looking for. So it's not all bad news, though. This is a little bit about the benefits of an effective compliance program that we want to talk about now. Both the Brazil Clean Company Act and the UK Bribery Act provide a compliance defense for companies, which is to say that if a company can document and evidence that they have an effective compliance program that is risk-based, that covers the areas that the guidelines would suggest should be there, and it applies throughout the organization, that can be a mitigating factor for companies in an investigation or a prosecution, and potentially a full defense, actually, to an action. But very, very important. And even the FCPA, although by its terms it doesn't provide a compliance defense, there are other guidelines that U.S. prosecutors use routinely that make it clear that enforcement authorities will take into account a company's compliance program, both in deciding whether to charge a company in the first place, and then on the back end in deciding what kind of sentence to impose if a company is charged. So, having a program in place is really crucial.
I think the best example of a management system or a compliance program that was beneficial to the company is the Morgan Stanley case. And here's a situation where a managing director was charged with bribing a Chinese government official. And Morgan Stanley, when the Department of Justice was looking at this, they really looked at Morgan Stanley's corporate compliance program and how well it was implemented. And they found that the program was well designed and well implemented. And some of the features of it were the direct reporting to the board and the general counsel, that employees had been trained repeatedly on internal policies and the relevant anti-corruption laws, and that there was ongoing monitoring of transactions and random transaction audits. So what we see here is that a pattern of implementing this program. They were conducting extensive due diligence on new partners that were coming in. So when the Department of Justice looked at this, they were able to say that Morgan Stanley as a corporation does have a well-implemented compliance program, not just a policy, not just a piece of paper, but they have people that are involved in this on an ongoing basis. And the outcome here is that there was no prosecution of the company. The individual was prosecuted, but from the Department of Justice standpoint, they said that this is not a corporate problem. This is the action of an individual. And that's a huge difference. So they were not prosecuted. They avoided all of the fines, the legal proceedings, the reputational damage. And in fact, reputationally, the opposite occurred, is that it really built their reputation as an organization. So that's really one of the best cases that I've seen of how a company put in an effective program and really got a return on investment from the time that they had put into it. So now if we start to look at, we talk about an effective compliance program, what does it consist of? Well, we'll step back a minute and say, what is a management system? Well, a management system is, in my opinion, is really trained, committed people routinely following procedures to accomplish something. So if we break this down, trained, committed people means that the people, of course, must have been trained, but they have to have commitment, and that commitment comes from senior management commitment and commitment down through the organization so that people understand that this is important to the company. Routinely following procedures, that means that the procedures need to be practical. The program needs to be designed in a way that it does not prevent or prohibit somebody from doing their job. Because when push comes to shove is an American expression, but if somebody's given the choice between being able to do their job effectively or follow a compliance program, people will always tend toward doing their job. So it's your responsibility to design a program that is practical for the people to follow, not overly burdensome. And there's two parts to it. Again, I want you to keep thinking about system development, which would tend to be the paperwork side of a management system, but implementation. And it's that implementation that really starts to embed the anti-corruption activity into how the company operates. So looking back at Morgan Stanley, the fact that they were doing ongoing monitoring of transactions, the fact that they had repeated training for people, and it doesn't have to be long training. We'll get into that in a minute, but they had at least a record of having done training for people on an annual basis. These are the things that start to show implementation, and that really is the goal. I've seen some companies that they might have 200 or 300 pages of procedures and manuals and codes of conduct and things like that. Let me tell you, nobody reads those. What you do need is something that is brief, concise, effective, and repeatedly discussed. Short bursts of information is better than one long session. And the other thing to think about with implementation is that you need to think about two levels: inside your company, but then with your regional offices, your subsidiaries, and third parties. And a little story about that. We were working with a mid-sized multinational company, had 8 regional offices, and headquarters had put together a very thorough anti-corruption policy. And we were involved in looking to see how things were being implemented. When we talked to the different regional offices, only 3 of 8 even knew the policy existed. So you think about how early stage that is. Not only did they had a policy which headquarters had adopted, so that's a good first step. They hadn't even effectively communicated it to the regional offices. Forget about implementation. They didn't even have effective system development there. So that's another thing for you to think about. You might think, oh, we got this covered at headquarters, but what if you go to your subsidiary in another country? What if you go talk to your dealers, or you talk to your agents that are the ones selling or selling to government officials or bidding on contracts? What do they know about your policy? What do they do to follow your policy? And what we're going to talk about now is what are the pieces of a compliance program that will help you to kind of embed this in how you operate. So we break it down into 7 elements. And I'm going to walk through each of these briefly to give you an idea. But before I do, I'm going to flip to the next slide for a second. As we talk about each of these categories, I want you to think about a maturity level of 1 to 5. And as I go through the categories, you think about your company and you think, are we a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 at this in my company and in my supply chain or with regional offices? And what I want to focus on here is the idea of implementation. So if we look up here, even at a level 3, we're still at inconsistent implementation. When we get up to 4, that's when we have a well-developed paper-based system that is consistently implemented. So I'm going to go back now to the other slide into the categories. But right now, I want you to, as I go through those categories, think about these 5 levels. So first, policies, procedures, and records. And we talked about policies. Those are the rules. And those are pretty simple to put together. The next thing would be procedures. How are people expected to follow the rule? And that's a harder thing to do because they have to be practical. The next thing to think about would be records. What kind of records are kept to show that people are following the rules? That's really foundational. Policies, procedures, and records, and that's a piece that will really start to show that your system is being implemented. The next thing that we look at would be the anti-corruption compliance team. Who's involved in this? Who's responsible for it? And at a more mature level, ideally there would be some kind of cross-functional team involvement so that you would have people from marketing, people from finance, people from legal, people from human resources coming together occasionally to discuss the implementation of the anti-corruption program. And it's that cross-functional team, one of the important things that happens with that is that that's what helps to make it practical, so that you don't have somebody sitting in a room writing up a bunch of procedures and then pushing it out at people. If you get the involvement of the different departments, you might have the marketing people saying, wait, we can't do that. That procedure is not effective in how we operate. Why don't we try it this way? You have the HR people saying, okay, well, we already have training programs going on. Why don't we just add a 5-minute module to our training programs on these other issues? You start to get some more buy-in. You start to get ideas from different parts of the organization, and that's what starts to make it practical. Because the end result that we want is a practical system that is implemented inside the organization and then cascaded. The next thing that we talked about before is the risk assessment. And here, the formality of it is important. The repeated nature of it. Did you do it once? Do you do it repeatedly? Do you do it when you enter a new country? And then what are the things that you look at? A lot of companies only think about country risk. So they would say inherently, okay, Indonesia is riskier than Norway, period, the end. That is not a good risk assessment. A good risk assessment would be to go to the next level to see what type of transaction is it. What kind of risk do we have? And again, going back to probability of something negative, and then the severity of something negative. And if you just start to simply look through these things, it really starts to give you a better framework for how to build your program in an effective and practical way. Next would be management of supply chain. And this really also covers due diligence on third parties. So what do the contracts look like? And what is the due diligence that's conducted? Very important elements, but you can't only rely on the contracts. You have to have some kind of more comprehensive program than that. Next would be training and capacity building. I mentioned before an effective system is trained, committed people. Well, how does that happen? It happens through training. And the training that you do, of course, there's good training and bad training. And what we see as some of the best practices are short, repeatable training. 5 minutes here, little snippets in the newsletter, special announcements, certain things that kind of keep it in people's mind as opposed to sitting them down for a day once when they join the company and never talking about it again. How you do that training and how you integrate it is important. One thing that we see companies doing that's effective is if you have global summits for your own staff or maybe for dealers, for agents, for suppliers, pull a little time out of that summit and have somebody give a presentation there. Those are the types of things where you can integrate it into what you're already doing, and it becomes more part of how the company operates. And then these last two pieces are really important, and they really come out of the quality management systems idea. So any of you are familiar with ISO 9000 or some of the other quality management standards. Two of the really fundamental pieces are monitoring and corrective action. So the monitoring is, how are we doing? And that monitoring can be done internally. So you could be doing internal monitoring. You could do formal internal audits where you have an independent party from inside your company come in and audit the system to see how it is. You could use external people to monitor. But the point here is that is there some type of monitoring taking place on an ongoing basis? And then action. What do you do with the information that you get from monitoring? Ideally, what we want to do is we want to take that information and make improvements in the system so that if we see we repeatedly have problems with gifts and we see that repeatedly our agents are giving gifts that exceed our policy amount, why has that happened? Is it poor communication? Are they not aware? Are they aware but they aren't following it? Is it a poor approval process where they're able to do it repeatedly? The idea would be to try to identify the repeated problem and then look underneath to see what can we do at a systems level to improve it. So those are the 7 parts. I mentioned before, excuse me one second. I mentioned before about the 5 levels of maturity and how this plays out in our system, and is that we have an online self-assessment that people can take. And it goes through and it would ask you a series of questions, multiple choice questions, and as you answer the questions, you will get a maturity score on a scale of 1 to 5 in each of those categories. The next thing that we do in our full program is that we then conduct an independent evaluation. Using the same scoring system, we really take a look to see what do we think in terms of where you are. And usually there's a gap. Typically the gap might be a point, point and a half. So if a company on average thinks that they're around a 3, we might think that they're closer to a 2 on the maturity scale. The point is not to say that you are right or wrong. The point is to get an expert opinion. It's like going to the doctor. You know, you might have an opinion of your health. The doctor might have a different opinion that is more informed or takes into account more information that and awareness that they have of certain health issues. And then we also then produce improvement plans. And this report would generate a summary that would look at how we prioritize where you should improve, what are the areas that you could spend time on in the most efficient way to start to put in the building blocks for a better program. And all of that is really based on where you are now. Because the idea with any kind of management system program is the idea of continual improvement. So we look at where we start now, because we can't improve what we don't measure. So create leading practices is a way to measure where you are now in terms of maturity, then to start to strategically identify what to do to improve the maturity. We also have a guide that we wrote that's available to companies that we work with, 200 plus pages, that has checklists and forms and sample languages, contract language. It has risk assessment tools. It has due diligence forms, a host of things to try to make it easier for companies to implement. And this program is available currently in Brazilian Portuguese, in Spanish, Chinese, and English. Now, what we wanted to do for those of you that are here on the call is to give you a chance to benchmark your current anti-corruption program. And what we'd like to offer is that we would actually do a guided self-assessment with you. So instead of you just having to go off on your own and do a self-assessment, we actually would work you through the self-assessment. So it kind of combines a little bit of the self-assessment and the independent evaluation, because we would be there to explain the questions, discuss the answer options with you, and really help to educate you along the way as to some of the elements of it and some of the things that we think are important areas in an effective program. So that's something that we'd like to offer to all of you. If any of you have interest, just send an email to this address, info@create.org, and we would be happy to arrange for what we'd call a guided self-assessment. You'll get the scoring, there'll be benchmarking, you'll be able to benchmark your scores against other companies that have gone through it. And it's a great way to start to see where you are and then start to think about where to put resources for improvement, if needed. I mean, you might find that you're in great shape. But that's something that we'd like to offer to you now. Leslie, anything that you want to add?
No, I think we've covered it well. If there are any questions, of course, we'd be happy to address those.
Okay, yeah, we have a few minutes left now, and if any of you have questions, please type them in on the chat, and we will answer your questions. We will make this webinar available. It's being recorded, so you would have access to that. And we also could send you the slides separately if that was of interest. If you send a note in, we could arrange to send you the slides also. Okay, we have a first question coming in, and the first question is more of a logistics question. It is, how long does the self-assessment take? Self-assessment usually takes about an hour, and if we were doing a guided assessment, it may take a little longer depending on how much discussion there was, but it would be, you could still ballpark about an hour for it. We have another question that came in here. This is related to effective ways. Somebody's asking here, do we have any ideas on how you can share policy ideas with third parties? And I mentioned before that one of the ways that we think is effective is integrating it into the other communications that you have with third parties. So think about that. Do you host meetings with them? Do you have people that are routinely visiting them? One really effective way is, because we don't want to add cost to companies. We want to try to minimize the added cost. So if you think about, who do I have that is visiting that company on a routine basis? So it may be that if it's a sales agent, I might have a marketing person that is visiting them or visiting a dealer on a routine basis. If I educate that person just a little bit on the anti-corruption program and make it a part of what they do when they go there anyway, it has two benefits. One, it's not adding cost, and two, it starts to help to embed the idea of compliance into the core business operations. The same is true upstream. Companies have people that routinely visit suppliers. It could be your quality control people, it could be engineering people, it could be people that are doing labor or environmental compliance audits. Give them a little bit of training about your compliance program And they then can become a way to spread that message and a way to monitor and a way to collect information for you of what's happening without adding a whole nother layer of cost to your system. So we always want to look at ways that we can use what's already happening and try to add a little bit. And that's what helps to really get the system well implemented. Any other questions out there? Okay, we have a new question. The best way to, so the question here is how do we, what would we recommend that you implement it inside and then spread it to other companies? And the answer to that is yes. So we would recommend that you start to build the foundational elements in your company, and then you start to cascade it to other companies that you're working with, either subsidiaries, joint ventures, or third parties. Important to get some of those foundational pieces done internally. I don't think you need to be a high level in all those categories before you start to cascade it, but it is important to have some of the foundational pieces around policies, procedures, risk assessment, and some of the training aspects done internally. Any other questions? I think we're coming up on the end of the hour. Leslie, anything that you would like to say to wrap up?
No, I think we've covered it. Thank you, everyone, for being involved today. We appreciate your time and the opportunity to talk a little bit about compliance today.
Yeah, we really appreciate you joining us. And if you have any follow-up questions, let us know. And if you're interested in that guided self-assessment, let us know about that also, and we will schedule a time. And it would be with one of our experts. It could be somebody like Leslie or myself that would kind of guide you through it as a way to help you learn and a way to help you measure. Because remember, you can't improve what you don't measure. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Bye.
There.